Okay, some crazy sounds going on with the headset. So when you return your headset to the AV desk, don't put it too close. Okay, so thank you very much, Giancarlo. It's quite an emotional ending there. And I'm now going to hand over to the chair for the rest of the African Leaders' Day morning, and he'll introduce the speakers and also questions from the floor. We'll have roving mics. So please give a warm welcome to Mario Franco, the chair of Millennium Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Aqaba, to everybody. Today and during the morning, we go to discuss two main pillars of this innovation Africa. One is education, and the second, or the other one, not necessarily the second, impact. How we move from education and having impact in the continent, in our societies. Then, from education to work. That will be what I will try to drive all the conversation with amazing speakers and without wasting any of your time. To start, and with no further ado, I call Honorable Charles Clarke. He's a former UK Secretary of State of Education, is now a Cambridge consultant, and I don't see any better starting. The topic of the presentation will be where education and work meet, from access to impact, from education to work. Please, Charles, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, Mario, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really delighted to be here today. It's an honor to be in this hall. I thought the best place to start in presenting this, particularly after that tremendous anthem we had this morning, and Matthew's referenced the importance of the African Union, is a document produced in 2015 by the African Union, Agenda 2063, Transformed Continent. And my argument in this presentation is that education is absolutely central to that ambition. That document identified a number of specific aims: a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, an integrated continent politically united and based on the ideals of Pan-Africanism and the vision of Africa's Renaissance, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice and the rule of law, and a peaceful and secure Africa. In all of these four, as well as the ones I shall mention in a second, high-quality education is critically important for the future success of this programme. An Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values and ethics. An Africa whose development is people-driven. That's, of course, at the core of everything that you do as ministers, relying on the potential of African people, especially its women and youth and caring for children. And Africa as a strong, united and influential global player. Now, that's a very ambitious programme that the African Union has set out. It's critically important to achieve. Important to realise that a 5-year-old today will be about 50 in 2063, that target date. So the people who are going to make the Africa of 2063 are precisely the people who are in school today in all of our countries, and how we achieve today will determine that success by 2063. But of course we're dealing with enormous change over that period. Firstly, international competition. Giancarlo described that a second ago in his presentation, because as Africa is changing over these years, so is every other part of the world, and the competition increases all the time and Africa has to fight for its place in that highly competitive world. There is the fourth industrial revolution, which by then I'm sure will be the fifth industrial revolution, with new technologies, artificial intelligence. So resulting from that, new forms of work, so the kinds of forms of work which we've been familiar with, simply won't be the forms of work which exist in 2063 in the way that things are moving forward. Our cultural identities will change in a variety of different ways. And the potential of women and youth will become particularly important and central to everything that's done. And finally, good governance. Already throughout this continent, good governance is changing and moving forward in so many very positive ways. But in each of those key areas of change, the choice that everybody will have to face, in Africa as elsewhere, is, are we going to be the masters of that process of change, or are we going to be its victims? So as the new technologies move forward, does that mean that other countries will be making their progress in the world and we are not? Or will we succeed in doing it ourselves? As new forms of work develop, as artificial intelligence moves forward, will we have conquered these issues? And all of these issues come at the end of the day down to our education system and to the way in which we succeed or don't succeed. But I want to just emphasize at the beginning that it's not just the education system. It's education and all of our partners in a variety of different ways. In each of the things that we are trying to achieve in the education system, developing the skills of the future, developing creativity and intelligence, which will be the key advantage that people have over machines in the new industrial revolution, and developing the resilience, resourcefulness and innovation which enables peoples to overcome the challenges of change successfully for them. It's not just the education system which has to do it. Of course, education institutions do. But also the ministries of labour and economy play a very important role in an enormous variety of different employers. Also the employers, public and private themselves, as they are changing in this complicated world. So the point I just want to emphasise in this introductory slide is it's something for the whole government, it's for the whole country to be involved in. And so the education ministers aren't simply an outpost of what government's doing. Education has to be absolutely at the centre of every government enterprise if we are to succeed in the ambitions set out by the African Union for 2063. And those skills that we're dealing with, that I've already mentioned, skills for the future, creativity, intelligence and resilience, resourcefulness and innovation, lead to what's going to be the bulk of my presentation this morning. 5 things. Effective school leadership. Getting a curriculum that relates to the workplace and what work is going to become. Promoting aspiration and assessment for every child. Improving the quality of teaching in every school. Developing high quality teaching and learning materials so that people can address the issues in a very informed and positive way. So those 5 subjects are what I'm now focusing. So firstly, effective school leadership. Most important of all, in my belief, is the role of the head teacher, effective school leadership. What is the ethos of the school? What is driving the school? What's the quality? And it's a big task for a Minister of Education to try and ensure that the role of the head teacher is strong, effective, and creating a climate within which the school can flourish. I talked about this with Matthew Prempeh on some occasions, and he's very committed in this country to making this happen, as I was when I was Secretary of State in England. But it was a very, very tough task. Second is the freedom to act, is the ability of the school to be able to address the issues in their particular community. If you have an over-centralised, over-bureaucratic, over-centrally driven system, individual schools aren't able to deal with the particular situations in their own communities. So thirdly, and this is critically important for educational work, is building partnerships from an individual school and individual college. A wide variety of partnerships with employers, public and private, creative organisations, non-governmental organisations, and building partnerships so that the school isn't just in its own bubble, but is part of the community and society which it's a part. So building that overall wider community and society. And then not simply focusing on the role of the head teacher, but on promoting leadership throughout the school, so that all the senior teachers are leaders in the school, and then teachers more generally leaders. And I've been to excellent schools where the students themselves are leading the younger students in a particular way. But this culture, effective school leadership, is centrally important. I've visited many schools in my life, and I enjoy doing it very much. Yesterday I had some good visits, which Matthew kindly organised to a couple of schools here in Accra. And the quality and engagement of the children everywhere is the same. But the quality of schools is different. The effectiveness of school leadership varies. And so focusing on that school leadership aspect is particularly important. Now, the second aspect that I mentioned is the curriculum and work. And there are a number of aspects of getting this right. The curriculum, getting a curriculum in the school which enables every child to be able to fulfill themselves for the future world, not the world that's been in the past. So reading and writing as a foundation is absolutely central. I don't think it's very possible for people who aren't in command of reading and writing to be able to really flourish in later life. There does need to be an overall framework about math, science, language, and wider culture. There does need to be a focus on creativity. That's something which schools often don't highlight anything like as much as they need to do so. And there does need to be a focus on building skills for the future, so that the future situation can be understood and students are able to deal with the evolution of the life into which they're going to find work and operate. You do need to have substantial vocational and technical education, and there are many countries in the world which have created a great division, which I don't think is at all wise, between the so-called academic education and the so-called vocational education. They need to be part and parcel of the same approach. And suddenly knocked myself out completely. And you do need, in my opinion, work experience, enabling children to experience work, so there's not a complete change from school to work without understanding what the workplace is. Now, my contention is if you take these various aspects of the curriculum and work, which I've highlighted here and which I've mentioned in what I'm saying, that means a need to re-evaluate the curriculum in many countries as to what's happening, both the national curriculum framework and the individual curricula in the individual schools. I would say that many school curricular systems don't have sufficient focus on creativity that's there, don't have sufficient focus on the skills for the future, have a strange relationship between vocational and technical education and the rest of the school process, and very few have substantial level of work experience for children in the school as they grow up, so they understand the place of work. So I think developing a curriculum for the future for that 2063 target is a very important and challenging approach. And it is really very worthwhile to think very carefully about exactly what form of curriculum works well in your country and with your schools. But of course, all that can only succeed with a commitment also to aspiration and assessment. Education for all, no child left behind, whatever the political slogan, and these are both big political slogans in various countries, you have to start from a belief, in my view, that every child has something to offer. Every child can become an adult who really can contribute to the society as a whole and fulfill their own skills in their own ways. Many education systems were formed as a kind of sieve to select the children who do well and to deselect the children who would do less well. I don't think that's a good way of looking at it. I think the best way to look at it is saying, actually, every child has something to contribute, so the question that arises is enabling that aspiration to happen, making it go through. That means being able to assess how a child is doing, being able to measure outcomes. The most successful programme I launched as the Secretary of State for Education was so-called London Challenge in Britain, and it lifted the quality of education in the City of London, a great world city, from being the lowest achieving in Britain to the highest achieving in Britain. And there were a number of reasons for the programme and the way it worked and the way it succeeded. But for me, the single most important component was an openness to really measuring how a school was doing, whether it was doing what it said it was doing, whether it was enabling every child to be able to fulfill themselves in every possible way. And assessment is something people sometimes have difficulty with. Measuring outcomes is something people have difficulty with. Accountability, the related concept, is also something that people have difficulty with. But at the end of the day, schools need to be able to justify themselves as making a significant difference to the lives of the children who they're educating. And you can only do that by measuring how they're doing. But of course, the measuring is not an exercise in itself. It's about then developing a feedback, an improvement for the quality of teaching, for the quality of education for the children. So you learn from the assessment you've done to say, well, we need to do this, that, or the other better. We need to work in other ways better. This is a strength of the child. This is a weakness of the child, whatever it may be. So it's not just assessment numbers for their own sakes. It's feeding it back into the education of the children. And then you do need a level of accreditation, because most people outside the school world, most employers, most universities are looking to see an accreditation of what the child has achieved and can achieve. So you've got to link together those various aspects of an assessment system which measures outcomes successfully, which then feeds back to the parents, the children, and the teachers in order to secure improvement, and then accredits what the child is able to do for a future life in a contribution that they can make. And to do all that in an effective way, it needs an effective system of inspection and transparency so that it's possible for the society as a whole to understand how that the school is performing to the best of its capacity and is able to move forward in a good way. But the centre of all these things, I've mentioned the other categories, but for me, and I'm sure for you as well, the number one issue is the quality of teaching. That remains the central and most important thing to achieve, and it's, I think, the toughest problem for education ministers. All the education ministers I've ever met have been preoccupied about improving the quality of their teachers, not always sure how to go about doing it, but knowing that that is the key to the success of the whole system. The outlook, the characteristics, the approach of the teachers are absolutely central. And so you have to approach that firstly through a strong system of initial training of teachers with academic theory, with classroom practice. But the final element, understanding society and the world of work, in my experience isn't so commonly done. Teachers are often educated in that initial training within the circle of the school system, but not really thinking about the wider society and that wider kind of area of work. And I'd say the dimension which brings education and work together so strongly has to be that bringing of a wider awareness in. And that applies too through continuous professional development and change. At the schools I was at yesterday morning, I was told about the system that exists here in Accra in these schools of continuous professional development, which was quite strong. The question arises, is the teacher themselves responsible for making that work in a good way? Is it somebody else who's supposed to do it for them? At the end of the day, we all know any change like this can only really happen successfully if the teachers themselves are committed to improving themselves. Can you use educational technology to help improve the quality of teachers and take it forward? I believe it's certainly absolutely possible to do it and very necessary to do so. So I suppose that number one priority of raising the quality of teaching is the biggest and most difficult task, but quite difficult to really make it happen and carry it through in the way that's necessary. So the final one of the elements which I think is important is good quality teaching and learning materials. I mentioned educational partnerships in relation to work. I mentioned them in relationship to partnerships with other universities, post-school organisations. I mentioned them in relation to cultural organisations. All of those can help strengthen the teaching and learning materials which are available in a school. And of course, Teachers need materials to help them, whether textbooks or digital materials, in whatever is the best way. Educational technology can make a difference, as we saw in the session earlier on of Giancarlo's, but only up to a point, to a limited degree. And the pedagogy, i.e. how the educational technologies are used, are exceptionally important. And then, of course, the teacher training is very important as well. It's no good putting in computers if the teachers don't know how to teach them or how to use them. No good to have textbooks which the teachers aren't familiar with. You have to synchronize these things in the same kind of way, which is not always easy. So, in my final slide, I just want to sum up and go back to where I started, the whole Reaching Africa 2063. I think the ambition the African Union set is incredibly important. I think it's an ambition which is very worthwhile. Is it going to be only words, or is it going to be something which is substantive and delivered? I think the people who are going to be the most important in determining the answer to that question is you, the Ministers of Education. I think more than any other part of government and part of the society, whether you can help drive Africa to set out its ambition. And that first and foremost, that means future, not past. Many education systems focus looking backwards, not looking forwards. Today, that's not good enough. It's important to have an education system that looks forward, which is why I've put it in the context of 2063. Consistent national focus and leadership, wide support and engagement, not just the educational world, but across the whole society, and partnerships to achieve that. I think your ambition in this area, in this great continent, is absolutely admirable. It's absolutely what must be achieved, and I think it can be done, but it's very tough. And I hope that this morning I've been able to give some thoughts to help think our way through that process. So Mario, I think you wanted to move to questions and discussion more widely.
Oh, thank you. Hello, thank you. I think this was a very good introduction to our African Leaders Day and enlighten us on some bullet points on the role of the governments, but not only. Then we have now a few minutes for questions or comments. There are microphones around the room. Is there any question? One question. Dominique, please.
Dominic Savage from the Education World Forum. Charles, you talked about the importance of head teachers and about leadership in schools. And I think what you were implying is you are not going to get an improvement in teaching and learning unless actually you have a strong head teacher with a good leadership team. I remember when you were Secretary of State with the London Challenge and all that was done to try and develop schools in London. But there's a word that I want to introduce here, which is the basis of my question, and the word is about trust. Because as a Minister of Education, how do you create the circumstances in which you can trust your head teachers? Because that, in a sense, is the problem. Head teachers feel that an awful lot is being expected of them. In the UK, they have Ofsted breathing down their necks all the time, and there is not necessarily the feeling that they are being trusted. But equally for a minister, how can you trust a head teacher and leadership teams in schools unless you have the evidence for that trust? And I wonder what practical things you can say to assist with that question.
I think that trust is always a two-way relationship. The first step for me is that the government and the ministers have to have a clear program, a clear approach, which is clearly articulated, which explains how the government is trying to achieve the points that are involved. If that doesn't exist, it's very difficult for teachers, or indeed anybody else, to have much trust in the government in the approach. If the government appears capricious or unclear or uncertain how to deal with the challenges, it's very difficult for everybody else, all the stakeholders, to use the jargon, to know where they stand in that process. So I think the first thing is the government has to be clear itself what its own strategy is on the questions that we're talking about. Secondly, I think the data that I described earlier is exceptionally important, and head teachers have to be ready to accept that they can be scrutinised, their schools can be scrutinised, and they can't simply assume that everybody will say, you're doing fine, it's absolutely okay. You mentioned the London Challenge. We had a position in London where there were a number of head teachers who were widely thought not to be very good and not to be very effective. It was a very difficult situation because people would say, well, let them get on to retirement another 3 or 4 years, that's all right. But if they weren't very good, that meant the children in that school for that 3 or 4 years, which was a big chunk of their school life, would lose their opportunities. And so we had to take some very hard decisions about moving some of those head teachers who were so-called coasting and not really putting dynamism in. And that is a tough decision for any government or any minister, but we were able to take it for a variety of reasons. But I think, so the second part of your question is the teachers have to deserve the support of the government, deserve the trust of the government by their performance, by demonstrating what they are achieving with their school and with their children. And that's why I go back to the accountability in the data, which I think is so important. If at the end of the day, the teacher is out of their depth, and that happens because it's a tough job being a teacher, it's a tough job being a head teacher, then they need to move on in the interest of the individual themselves and of the school and the people. But making that move on process happen is absolutely not straightforward.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions or
You've got one
comments? It can be a comment. Please, gentlemen, just introduce yourself, please, and floor is yours.
Good day, colleagues. I'm Archie Lewis, Western Cape Education Department in South Africa. I fully agree with all the issues you have mentioned, and I think we all sit with the same challenge across Africa, across the world. There's perhaps one thing that you have missed, and I don't think it was done intentionally. I think it has to do with the kind of teachers that we have in the system. We get teachers and we get teachers. We get teachers whom becoming a teacher or making it a profession was the last option on my list. And then you get teachers who wanted to be teachers in order to participate in educating our children, our country, in order to make it a better place. A good and committed teacher don't need a good principal or head teacher. You don't need inspections. If you are committed to what you want to do with the children and trust it to you, you will do it without no one having to oversee you. And I think that is what we are missing and that we're all struggling with, to get our teachers motivated so that when they are in the classroom, to do what they need to do and to do what they get paid for to do.
It's a very interesting question. I half agree with you, but not completely. There's a very famous British writer, Bernard Shaw, many years ago, who famously made a very insulting remark about teachers when he said, he was a playwright and a socialist, he said, those who can do and those who can't teach, is what he said. And he defined in exactly the way you set it out that teachers were people who'd failed to do whatever they were going to do. I don't think that's true. Most teachers I've met are deeply committed, deeply positive people in precisely the way you described. But they do need an atmosphere within which they can teach. It's not so much a head teacher overseeing them or instructing them, but a head teacher who's providing the support and framework for teachers teaching to be able to express itself. And I've met plenty of head teachers who don't allow good teachers to succeed in teaching. And I've met plenty of head teachers who do allow not such good teachers to become great teachers by the support they put in. So I do think the role of the head teacher is very important. But then you've got a problem as a minister. If you think that of your teachers, say for the sake of argument, 10 or 15% fall into your category of being great teachers who don't need motivation, then what do you do about the other 85%? Or if the figures are more generous, if it's 50% who you think are great teachers, what do you do about the other 50%? And the initial teacher training can't solve that problem because you're there for 40, 50 years, the whole of that period up to between now and 2063. Those teachers who aren't adequate, are you simply going to let them be there all the time? Or do you say, actually, we've got to try and improve this? Now, I'm strongly of the view that you can try and improve it. It is worth trying to improve it. And for the large number of teachers who would benefit from a supportive teaching environment, it is down to the head teacher to create that.
Thank you. One last question or comment. Gentlemen, please. Now the time is shorter.
Yeah. My name is
Okay, please.
Marte Hussaini from Nigeria, Borno State. Quality of teaching is very important. This is what we are facing in Africa, and especially in terms of science subjects, maths, physics, chemistry, and biology. And in some parts of Nigeria, actually you don't even find physics teachers. Recently we visited a secondary school. They had no physics teacher, only chemistry, biology. So this is critical. And also, in some schools, the teachers do not even go to the school. So in the 60s and 70s in Nigeria, we have this inspectorate division where inspectors go to make sure that the teachers attend the school, they teach. So we are trying to introduce something like that in our state. Lastly, in Africa, what we really lack, we totally forget nursery teaching. In United States and even England, you find that teaching starts even at the age of 1, 2, 3, 4. But in Africa, we totally ignore that aspect because in the first 2 years of life, that's where almost 80% of the sign-ups are formed. Very important. Then you have the next 8 years. So it's important to really emphasize on pre-primary school teaching as well as primary school teaching to lay a very good foundation for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have no more time for questions. The next, please.
Just very briefly, firstly, I completely agree with your emphasis on pre-primary teaching. Our government had a major program called Sure Start, which was about trying to achieve that, and I agree with you, it's a very important foundation. It's not yet done very well in many countries, in my opinion. But on your second point about the journey to getting qualified teachers universally, all I can say on that is it's important to have a program, a plan, which takes you forward step by step to recruit teachers, to train teachers, even in the most isolated communities. And there's no shortcut to that. It's simply, I'm sure you're doing it in Nigeria, is to have a process of gradually improving the situation. You can't wave a magic wand and suddenly say we'll get there. And I think the reason, I'll conclude with this, Mario, why I chose to take the Africa 2063 slogan as the theme of what I was presenting this morning, is that, in my opinion, is the right way to do it. Is to say we've got a 45-year program, we're going to try and work our way through and steadily improve. But you have to do that. You have to make the steps, take them forward. But with that, I'm sure it's possible to make great progress. Thank you very much indeed this morning.